The wind moved like a ghost across the valley, silent, searching, tugging at the dry grass and the frayed hem of a woman's torn dress. The cottonwood tree stood alone, its bark silvered with age, branches bare as bones. And tied to it, arms slack, head bent low, cheek swollen purple where a blow had landed, was a woman of 25 winters. Her dark hair clung to her face in knotted strands. Blood crusted along her temple. Her eyes, though half-lidded, held a clarity that did not belong to someone broken. Not quite. They had left her here before dawn. Her husband's family. The ones who'd taken her in with polite smiles and promises of kinship. Who'd whispered of hope when she married into their blood. And who, after 4 years without a child, decided she had no more worth than an old mule that wouldn't pull. They didn't kill her. That would have been too clean. Too merciful. They tied her instead, hands raw against the rope, mouth gagged with the corner of her own shawl, and rode off before the sun rose. Said nothing. Not even her husband. He watched from the porch. His boots didn't move an inch. The cold was quiet, at first. The kind that settles like a second skin. But by mid-morning, it began to creep deep, curling into her ribs, pressing its fingers behind her eyes. Her breaths turned shallow. Birds flew overhead, and she could not lift her head to see them. Her knees buckled once. Then again. She let them, slumping forward, the rope cutting into her wrists. Somewhere far away, wolves howled. She thought she might not be afraid of them. Time slipped sideways. She remembered the first time she had come to this land, how big it felt, how wide the sky stretched. Her mother-in-law had said, "It's a land for strong women." She had smiled then, proud. Foolish. The snow began to fall again. Slow flakes that caught in her lashes. It blurred the horizon, softened the world. She stopped shivering. She stopped feeling much of anything. Maybe that was what dying felt like, not a sharp end, but a gentle fading. Then came the sound of hooves. She didn't lift her head. Couldn't. Thought perhaps the in-laws had returned, maybe to finish what they'd begun. Or maybe just to watch the last of her go. But the horse slowed. Stopped. Boots thudded softly into snow. Then silence. And then, a voice. Low. Gravel in the throat, but warm at the edges. God above. A pause. Another step. She flinched as something brushed her cheek, a gloved hand, checking breath. The rope around her arms shifted. A knife moved through it with care, not haste. When her knees gave out entirely, arms caught her. She could smell him. Not sweat, not whiskey. Cedar. Saddle leather. The scent of someone who lived simply and didn't apologize for it. "I got you," he said, though it came more like a murmur than a promise. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He spoke as if the world had already settled. Her head rested against his shoulder, and she heard his heart, steady, slow, like the ticking of an old clock in a quiet house. The last thing she saw was the cottonwood tree drifting away behind them, its silhouette soft against the snowblind morning. When she woke again, the light was low, dusk, or maybe early dawn. The smell of smoke and pine filled her nose. She lay on a bed layered with old quilts, each stitched with patterns of a life she didn't know. Her dress was gone. In its place, a long shirt that smelled of soap and winter sun. Her hands, once scraped and bloodied, were wrapped in clean bandages. A fire crackled. Somewhere to her left, a pot steamed. She heard the clink of metal, the shift of boots across wooden floorboards. She didn't speak. She just listened. He didn't speak either. Not at first. She dared a glance, slow, cautious. He sat near the fire, back to her, carving something small from a block of wood. His coat was draped over the chair. His shoulders were broad, his neck brown by years beneath the sun. Gray threaded through his dark hair. He looked not like a savior, nor a stranger, but someone who had spent a lifetime surviving things he never spoke of. "You're awake," he said quietly, still not turning. His voice was softer now, gentled by the firelight. "I made stew. It's not much. But it's warm." She didn't answer. Her throat felt like ash. She shifted slightly, and the quilts rustled. At the sound, he stood, walked to the small table, and poured water into a tin cup. He handed it to her with both hands. No questions. No pity. Just offering. She took it. Drank. The water was cool, clean, and something about it made her eyes sting. "You can rest here," he said, placing the cup aside once she finished. "I won't ask your story. You can tell it when you're ready. Or never at all." Still she said nothing. But her fingers gripped the edge of the quilt, just a little. "I'll sleep out in the barn," he added, voice so low it nearly vanished into the crackling fire. "Door's yours to lock." She didn't respond. But her shoulders dropped a fraction, as if something long carried had slipped away. He stepped back, gathered his coat, and walked outside. She lay in the stillness for a long time, eyes on the ceiling beams. Her body ached. Her soul throbbed. But there was no rope on her wrists. No shadows at the edge of the bed. Just wind pressing gently against the windows. She closed her eyes. Sleep returned, not like a thief this time, but like a friend. And somewhere out in the barn, a quiet cowboy leaned back on a stack of hay, stared up into the rafters, and wondered what kind of world let men tie women to trees and ride away as if nothing had been done. The next morning, she rose slowly. Dressed in the same oversized shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she moved anyway. Toward the table. Toward the door. The snow outside had begun to melt in soft patches, revealing damp earth beneath. And in the distance, the cottonwood tree still stood. But this time, she was not tied to it. She was standing. Alive. And not alone. The days that followed moved like smoke, quiet, shapeless, slow to rise. She did not ask where she was. He did not offer the name of the place. All she knew was the steady warmth of the cabin, the muffled wind beyond the walls, and the way silence was allowed to exist between them without strain. It was a strange mercy. One she did not know how to carry. He came and went like a shadow, bringing firewood, skinning rabbits, rinsing his hands in the basin before setting a plate on the table. He never looked her directly in the eyes, not out of shame but out of respect. There was no hunger in him. No questions. No pity. And so, she let herself drift. The pain in her limbs faded first, followed by the bruises. Her throat remained raw longer, not from screams, but from the silence she'd held inside her for years. That kind of silence doesn't go quickly. It settles in the lungs and the marrow. It becomes part of your gait. One afternoon, as a pale sun filtered through the single windowpane, she caught him at the hearth, rubbing a cloth across a tin kettle. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone used to taking care of things that had already been worn through. She sat at the table, hands clasped in her lap. Her hair had been brushed out the night before, long strands falling over her shoulders in loose waves. She had done it herself. Her hands had trembled. But she had done it. He placed the kettle near the fire, then looked at her, briefly. Just enough to make her feel seen. "Do you have a name?" he asked, as if he'd only just remembered the world required such things. She hesitated. Her lips parted, then closed again. She stared at the steam rising between them. "Yes," she said softly, though she did not speak it aloud. He nodded. That was enough. Later that evening, she walked out onto the small porch. The snow had thinned, revealing patches of black soil and faded tufts of yellow grass. The land around the cabin rolled into the hills, where pine trees lined the edge of a darkening sky. It was the kind of view people passed over. Unremarkable. Still, she found herself staring. He joined her without a word, resting his hands on the porch rail. The boards beneath them creaked in the cold. "There's no one else here," he said eventually. "Not for miles." She didn't answer. Her breath came in little clouds. The distance felt safe. "I don't get many visitors." She glanced sideways. His eyes were fixed on the tree line. His jaw was covered in rough stubble, the gray in his beard more prominent now that the light was fading. He looked like a man carved out of the land itself, weathered, solid, too quiet to ever be a threat. "You live alone?" "Since the war," he replied simply. Then added, "And longer than that, really." Something in his tone made her look away. There was history in his voice, but he wasn't handing it to her. Just laying it on the table, like a piece of bread, to take or leave. She nodded once, then turned back inside. That night, sleep came differently. Not like a pit she fell into, but like a tide that pulled her gently out to sea. In the dark, she dreamed of a field without fences. And when she woke, the fear wasn't waiting at her bedside. In the days that followed, she began to move more. She washed the dishes he left. Folded her borrowed clothes neatly. She swept the floor with a hand broom that had only half its bristles left. Not because she was expected to. Because she needed to remember she could. He left most mornings before sunrise and returned when the light turned gold. Once, she saw him returning with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, snow on his boots, carrying a pail of water like it weighed nothing. He didn't look tired. Just used to it. He never left without checking that the fire was strong and the table had bread on it. One afternoon, while he was out, she found a shelf with books, worn, leather-bound, the pages yellowed and smelling of dust. She opened one. Inside were pressed flowers, flattened with care. A sprig of lavender. A faded wild rose. A leaf the color of rust. Each one tucked between scripture or poetry like a memory sealed in time. She turned the pages with reverence. When he returned and saw the book in her hands, he did not speak. He only nodded once, as if to say it was all right. As if he'd expected her to find it. He went to the fire and began carving again. A small piece of cedar rested in his palm, his knife moving slow and sure. She watched him, the way his shoulders curved slightly as he worked, the way he paused now and then to brush shavings from his lap. He had the quiet patience of someone who had waited before. Waited, and lost. She sat near the fire, not too close. Her hands folded the hem of her skirt again and again. "Did she make the book?" she asked at last, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look up. But the knife stopped moving. "She did," he said. A pause. "Then, she liked wild things. Even ones that didn't bloom proper." She let that settle between them. Then closed the book gently and placed it back on the shelf. That night, he didn't go to the barn. Instead, he unrolled a bedroll in the corner of the cabin. Gave her the bed without argument. Without reason. It was an act that said, "You belong in comfort now," and nothing more. She watched him curl up on the floor, the firelight flickering across the lines on his face. He turned his back to her, pulling the blanket to his chin. And somehow, in that quiet gesture, he offered more safety than any locked door could give. She lay back, eyes on the ceiling. Her body no longer flinched at every creak of wood. The dreams that came were gentler. No ropes. No shouting voices. Just wind in the trees and the sound of a horse's hooves crossing snow. One morning, a crow landed on the window ledge. Its black eyes peered in at her. She stood slowly, approached the glass, and stared back. Then she opened the window and let it fly away. Her breath misted in the air. Her hands were no longer shaking. He returned soon after, carrying a stack of cut wood. She met him at the door. He paused, surprised. She took the smallest log from the pile, held it to her chest, and turned inside. He followed without a word. That evening, they shared stew at the table. He'd added potatoes, the last of them. She lifted her spoon, and after the first bite, let out a breath that was almost a sigh. "This is good," she said. He glanced up, something close to a smile at the edge of his mouth. "I've made worse." She ate 3 spoonfuls more before setting the bowl down. For the first time, she didn't feel like a guest in someone else's life. When the night came, she did not wait for him to roll out the bedroll. She stood, took a folded quilt from the bed, and placed it beside the hearth. "You sleep there," she said gently. "It's your home." He looked at her, surprised, but said nothing. She lay on the bed, pulling the covers over her shoulders. Outside, the snow continued to melt. The land was changing again. And inside the cabin, something old and heavy had begun to shift, not all at once, but enough to breathe a little easier. She didn't know where the path ahead would lead. But tonight, her heart was not afraid of it. The snow lingered longer than it should have that year, stubborn in the hollows and shadows of the trees. But beneath its cold hush, something stirred, unseen, unsaid. A quiet shift in the soil. A murmur of thaw. Inside the cabin, the days unfolded like pages turning slow. She had begun to move through them with more purpose, less hesitation. Her steps steadier. Her breath less tight. The bruises on her body had faded to pale gold, but the bruises on her spirit remained, only now they had room to breathe. The man still said little. He was not given to small talk or needless sound. But his silence no longer unnerved her. It filled the cabin like a soft wind, steady and unthreatening. She began to understand it, how stillness could mean safety, how absence of noise could be a kind of care. Each morning, he saddled his horse while the sky still wore stars. Some days he took the trapline, others he went to chop wood near the southern ridge. She stayed behind by the fire, cleaning the stove, mending what little needed mending. She read from the old books. Pressed new flowers between their pages, fresh snowdrops, first crocuses, tiny things born brave in cold earth. He noticed the additions but never commented. Instead, he'd nod gently, as if approving something sacred. One late morning, as she stood near the stove, apron dusted with flour, she asked if he might show her how to mend the leather straps on the broken saddle. He didn't blink at the request, simply took her outside, handed her a bone-handled awl, and set a strip of hide across a low stump. He showed her how to pierce it slow, angle clean, fingers steady. His hands moved with the grace of someone used to building, not breaking. She mimicked the motion. Her stitches came crooked, but they held. He smiled faintly when she looked up, her forehead wrinkled in focus. "You ever work leather before?" he asked. "No," she said. "Only cloth." "You've got good hands for it." She turned her eyes back to the work, but something in her chest fluttered, not a thrill, exactly. Just warmth. Like a cold room where someone had finally lit a lamp. That afternoon, they shared bread at the porch step. The air smelled of pine and new mud. Far off, the creek had begun to sing again. He sat beside her, arms resting on his knees. "Most folks don't like spring," he said after a long stretch of silence. "Too much mess. Too much melt. Can't hide things anymore." She chewed slowly, letting the words sit. Then she said, "I don't mind the mess. It means something survived." He didn't speak again. But the look he gave her, sidelong, quiet, unreadable, said more than words could carry. The next week brought wind and rain. The kind that sloshes through boots and turns roads to rivers. They were kept inside for days, the world outside a blur of gray and shifting branches. She cleaned out the small closet near the hearth. Found a coat hung there, woman's size, worn soft at the collar. She didn't ask. She simply folded it with care and placed it back. They played cards once, at the kitchen table. She barely remembered the rules, and he didn't seem interested in winning. The game was just something to hold between them, like a shared memory that didn't belong to either of them alone. At night, she slept deeper. He still rolled out the bedroll near the fire, but some nights she'd wake and find he'd drifted off in the chair instead, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. She never covered him with a blanket, but she sometimes stirred the fire a little louder before going back to bed. One morning, he came back with a broken lantern. Glass shattered. Handle twisted. She watched as he examined the damage without frustration, just quiet acceptance, like a man who understood that most things break eventually. And some things, if mended with care, might shine again. As he sat by the work table, she brought over a cloth, holding out her hand for the bent pieces. He paused, then gave them to her. No questions. No warning. Just trust. They repaired it together. That evening, when the sun dropped low and bled gold across the ridges, she took the mended lantern out onto the porch and hung it on the hook beside the door. It swayed in the wind, a little crooked, but still catching the light. I used to think no one would want what's crooked, she said softly, almost to herself. He looked up at her, squinting against the dying sun. His voice was gentle, sure. Then they weren't worth knowing. She didn't answer. But her breath hitched slightly in her chest. The next day, they rode into town. She wore his spare coat, collar turned up, scarf tucked tight. She didn't want to go, but they needed supplies, and she didn't want him to keep doing everything alone. The horse beneath her was sturdy, calm. She kept her gaze forward as the town came into view, a cluster of buildings huddled against the wind, half swallowed by mud. When they tied up at the post outside the general store, the world felt sharp again. People stared. Whispers stirred. She kept her chin level. Walked beside him with hands inside her sleeves. Inside the store, the air was thick with sawdust and old tobacco. She helped him gather salt, flour, dried apples. The clerk behind the counter pretended not to know her. That was its own cruelty. Then came the voice, bitter and familiar. A scrape across her spine. Didn't think you'd show your face again. She turned slowly. Her husband's brother stood near the door, arms crossed, smirk carved into his face like a scar. He was thinner than she remembered, but the venom in his gaze was unchanged. You've got some nerve, he sneered. Running off like a dog in heat, letting some stranger haul you off. She said nothing. Her hand clenched around the sack of flour. She didn't run, the cowboy said. Come. Even. The whole store stilled. She was left. The man bristled. She's a curse. Always was. That's why nothing grew. Not a single child. The cowboy took a step forward. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't threaten. Just stood there, tall and quiet and unmoved. She won't answer to you again. A long moment passed. Then the man laughed, mean and thin. She'll come crawling back. You'll see. Broken things always do. But she didn't flinch. Didn't lower her eyes. She looked him full in the face, not with anger, but with something stronger. Indifference. They left the store in silence. But as they mounted up and rode away, her spine stayed straight. Her hand steady on the reins. He rode beside her, offering nothing but his presence. That was enough. Back at the cabin, they unloaded supplies. She placed the flour on the shelf, the apples in the tin. Then she walked outside. Past the firewood stack. Past the empty trough. She stood beneath the wide sky, hands in her pockets. The air was cold, but she didn't shiver. He joined her after a while. Didn't speak. Just stood near, boots crunching lightly in the softening snow. You didn't have to say anything, she murmured. I know, he replied. But you shouldn't have had to stand there alone. She turned to face him. The breeze caught her hair, blue strands across her face. You see me, don't you, she asked. Not with need, but with quiet certainty. I do, he said. They stood there a long while. The lantern by the door flickered in the wind. Somewhere nearby, a bird called, the first of spring. She didn't smile. Not yet. But her chest felt lighter. Like snow melting off a roof. And though no promises passed between them, something had taken root. Small. Fragile. But alive. The sun was gentler now. Mornings broke with birdsong instead of frost, and the soil around the cabin softened beneath her boots. She'd begun planting herbs in a row of clay pots near the porch, lavender, thyme, and wild mint. He'd built a small shelf for them without being asked, hammering in silence, wood chips catching in his beard. She thanked him with a nod and a loaf of fresh bread. He said it was the best he'd ever had, and though his words were few, she could tell he meant it. Their lives had found a rhythm, quiet and circular, like the way wind wrapped around hills. He'd ride into the canyon some days, bring back game or trade tools with an old friend who lived upriver. She would read, clean, write small thoughts in the margins of the books left behind. They never rushed each other. They didn't have to. But spring, as it often does, brought more than just bloom. It stirred up the past with all the inevitability of a storm. It began with hoofbeats. Not his. She was kneeling in the dirt by the herbs, soil under her fingernails, when she heard them, 3 horses, heavy and urgent, thundering up the narrow trail like a threat made flesh. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her skirts, eyes narrowing toward the dust rising at the bend. The sound reached the cabin, and the cowboy stepped onto the porch with a rifle balanced casually in his hand. The first rider came into view, tall in the saddle, face thin and bitter. Her brother-in-law. Behind him rode 2 others, one the sheriff, the other a man from town whose name she never knew but who always watched her too long in church pews. They stopped just shy of the porch. "Well, look who's playing house," the brother-in-law sneered. He dismounted, letting the reins dangle loose. "Didn't think we'd come looking, did you?" She didn't answer. Neither did the cowboy. "We've come to bring her back," the man said, louder now, eyes flicking from her to the sheriff. "Family's worried. Said she went mad. Took off without a word. Left behind a sick husband." Her jaw tightened. The lie felt cold, like metal in her mouth. The sheriff shifted in his saddle, uncertain. "They say you were unwell," he offered, not unkindly. "We just want to be sure." "She wasn't unwell," the cowboy said evenly. "She was abandoned. Tied to a tree. I cut her down myself." The words dropped into the air like stones. The brother-in-law laughed, sharp and short. "She's always had a flair for stories. Ever since she started bleeding wrong." "She doesn't belong to you," the cowboy said. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Let her speak, then. She's the one caught between claims." It had been a long time since her voice had felt this solid. "I didn't run," she said. "I was left to die. Beaten for being childless. That's the truth." The sheriff looked at her, studied the way her chin lifted, the faint scar still healing along her cheekbone. She did not look away. "I got bruises older than the day I was found," she added. "Ask yourself what kind of woman ties herself to a tree in the snow." The silence that followed was thick, uneasy. "She's not right in the head," her brother-in-law spat, stepping forward. "Don't listen to her nonsense. We can take her back and sort it out. It's family business." "She's not going anywhere," the cowboy said, voice low but clear. "You think she's yours now?" the man growled. "She's nothing but bad blood." "No," the cowboy replied. "She's her own." That stopped everything. Even the wind seemed to still. The sheriff dismounted slowly, walked over to her with hesitant steps. "You sure?" he asked her, tone quieter now. "If you stay, it won't be easy. Folks talk. These men won't let go of their grudge so simple." "I'm not afraid of them," she said. The sheriff gave a slow nod. "Then that's the end of it." Her brother-in-law cursed, kicked at the dirt. "This ain't finished," he warned, pointing a gloved finger toward the porch. "You'll both regret this." "I already have," the cowboy said. "And I'll carry those regrets myself." The men mounted up again, anger thick in their movements. When they rode off, their hooves tore up the thawing path, spraying mud and shame behind them. She stood still for a long time after they disappeared, heart thudding in her chest like a drum buried deep underground. The cowboy didn't speak. He walked to her side and stood in the warmth of the afternoon, close but not touching. "Are you all right?" he asked, finally. She nodded. Then said softly, "Thank you. I didn't do it for thanks." "I know." They went inside together, where the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and smoke. She poured 2 cups of tea without asking. He sat down and began cleaning his rifle, quiet and methodical. Later that evening, she found herself on the porch again, watching the light fade across the sky. The clouds were peach and lavender now, the color of old bruises healing. He joined her, leaning against the post. "They'll come again," she said. "Maybe." She turned toward him. "You're not afraid?" "No," he said. "But I've been tired a long time." Her breath caught. Not from fear, but something else. A shared weariness. A recognition. "I asked myself why you helped me," she said after a moment. He didn't answer right away. Just stared into the trees. "When I was younger," he said, "there was someone I didn't help. Someone I should have." There was more behind those words. A grave. A woman's coat in the closet. Pressed flowers in a book. But he didn't name them. He didn't have to. "I won't fail again," he said quietly. She stepped closer, slow and deliberate. Her fingers brushed against his, lightly, like a question, not a promise. He didn't pull away. In that touch, something opened. Not a fire. Not a storm. Just a steady warmth that settled deep, like sun beneath the snow. They stood there until the last light slipped behind the hills. Not speaking. Not rushing. But knowing something had changed. And it would not change back. The wind came harder that night, howling like something ancient and unsettled. A spring storm, wild with broken branches and low thunder, dragged itself across the valley as if the sky was angry with the earth. Inside the cabin, they sat close to the fire, candles flickering, rain spattering the windows like urgent fingers. She watched the flames, her hands wrapped around a cup of steeping tea, though it had long since gone cold. He whittled in silence, a shape taking form in the soft wood, but he wasn't watching his hands. He was listening. They both were. It was the sound that woke them. Not the rain. Not the wind. The crack of splitting timber. They moved together, swift and wordless, grabbing coats and boots and stepping into the mud-slick dark. The air stung with smoke. At first, it was hard to see, the world a blur of wet shadows and firelight. Then the shape revealed itself. The barn. Flames licking from its roof like hungry tongues, heat pulsing outward in waves. Embers snapped into the night, riding the wind like sparks seeking new homes to ruin. He rushed forward, cursing low, trying to wrench the door open. But it was already too far gone. The dry hay, the timbers, even the tools, everything they'd built and stored was devoured. She reached for his arm, but he didn't flinch. His jaw clenched, his eyes red with reflection. The horses, thank God, had been let out earlier. But the rest, gone. They stood there as the storm poured over them, water hissing against flame, smoke curling around their clothes. When it finally fell, the barn did not collapse with drama, just a slow, weary groan, as though even it had nothing left to hold. It was them, she said quietly. He didn't answer. But she could see it in his face. In the steady rage behind his stillness. They meant for it to be the cabin, he muttered. Or us. Her breath caught in her throat. The realization was slow but sharp, like a blade through cloth. She turned toward the hills, where the road vanished into forest. Where vengeance lived on horseback. We can't stay here, she said. He didn't nod. Didn't shake his head either. Just looked out at the ruins, the last of the fire guttering into blackened ash. They left before morning, taking only what they could carry, some dried food, the flour-pressed book, a rifle. She wrapped the old quilt around her shoulders and mounted the horse behind him, arms around his waist, face pressed into his back. The rain had passed, but the world still smelled of smoke and wet bark. The sky overhead was the color of slate. They didn't speak as they rode. The trees thinned, the trail widened. She recognized the curve in the land, the creek bed, the boulder with moss on its north side. And then it appeared. The tree. Still standing. The same one she'd been tied to, left for the wind to bury. The cottonwood looked older now, not because of time, but because of knowing. It stood like a witness, bark split where the rope had worn, trunk thick and scarred. The clearing was quiet, save for the rustle of wet leaves and a single bird singing low in the brush. She slid off the horse without waiting. Her boots sank into the damp earth as she walked to it. The rope was gone. The snow was gone. But the memory had rooted deeper than either. She reached out and laid her palm flat against the bark. This was where she died. And where something else had begun. He stood behind her, silent as ever, giving space. Always giving space. She pulled a small carving knife from her coat pocket, one of his. She turned it in her hand, then brought it gently to the tree's surface. Not in anger. Not for revenge. She carved slowly. A small flower. Simple, imperfect. But it bloomed there, in the middle of the old scar. When she stepped back, he was beside her. I thought I'd never see this place again, she said. Her voice wasn't shaking. And if I did? I thought I'd fall apart. You didn't. No, she said. I didn't. They stood together beneath the wide sky, wind tugging at their coats. The tree no longer loomed over her like a grave marker. It stood now like something ancient and living, a keeper of pain, but also of strength. I don't want to be afraid anymore, she said. You don't have to be. He reached out then, not to take, not to lead, but to offer. His hand hovered near hers, a silent question. She took it. And for the first time since the snow, since the rope, since her voice was taken from her, she smiled. They left the clearing on foot, leading the horse behind them. The trail ahead was long and uncertain. But neither of them looked back. At dusk, they camped beneath a cedar grove. He lit a fire, she boiled tea. Their hands moved in unison now, like two instruments finally tuned to the same song. After they ate, he brought out the carving he'd been working on, a bird, small and unpainted, wings just beginning to spread. For you, he said, setting it in her hand. She turned it over, feeling the grooves, the delicate care. You keep making things, she murmured. Even after everything burns. He shrugged. It's the only way I know to live. She held the bird to her chest. The night grew quiet. Crickets chirped. The stars appeared one by one, like cautious eyes watching from above. As they lay beside the fire, not touching, but near, she whispered the words she'd been holding like breath. You didn't save me, she said. He blinked toward her. I saved myself, she added. But you gave me room to remember how. He didn't answer right away. Just stared into the fire, the shadows painting his face in flickers. I'll never ask anything of you, he said. But if you stay, I'll build a place where you never have to run again. She closed her eyes. I'm not running, she said. I'm walking toward something. And in that moment, they were no longer what the past had made them. Not the beaten woman. Not the grieving man. Not the burned-out barn or the cottonwood tree. They were two souls, bent but not broken, walking into a life they would make with their own hands. And somewhere behind them, in a quiet clearing where the earth was soft and the wind whispered low, a scarred old tree stood watch. Its bark bore a flower now. And the tree still stood.